In Module 6, we're going to look at the presentation Creating Rubrics for Learning. The information in this presentation comes from Judith Arter and Jan Chappuis' book, Creating and Recognizing Quality Rubrics. So why rubrics? It's a word we've heard a lot as teachers, and so it probably makes sense to talk a little bit about why we would use them. Well, first of all, they can help us. They can help us as teachers to define complex learning targets and to ensure consistent judgment about the work we get from students. But more importantly, rubrics can help students. It can help students understand what we are expecting them to do. It can help them see how they can move from being a beginner to an expert. And it can help them explain why what they create is good or not good. Let's look at some of the types of rubrics. Holistic rubrics are rubrics that focus on one criteria, whereas analytic rubrics can focus on more than one criteria. So let's dive a little deeper into this holistic versus analytic. And Arter and Chappuis give a great example of an engine as a metaphor for these two kinds of rubrics. So if we ask the question, how well is the car's engine running? If we use holistic assessment, we consider how all the car's engine parts run together as one. And we might have a rubric that looks something like this: excellent, good, and fair, and then a description of how an excellent engine runs as opposed to a good engine and a fair engine. Well, we can ask the same question, how well is the car's engine running, and use an analytic assessment in which we consider how each of the car's engine parts run independently. So here we would have criteria such as RPM, or revolutions per minute, and leaks and sounds. And we'd have excellent, good, and fair, and descriptions of how each of those independent criteria look at those levels. We can also have a task-specific rubric, which applies to a unique performance or task. And in this example, here is plant growth experiment you'd see in science. And you have the different tasks students would do and the criteria for each of them. This type of rubric could only be used for this plant growth experiment. You wouldn't be able to apply that in a general sense. To do that, you would want to use a general rubric, which could be applied to a number of similar performances or tasks. So here the example is just a science experiment. The levels here would be the levels of expertise, novice, practitioner, and then you would have the criteria, scientific thinking, scientific strategies, and a description generally of what that looks like at those different levels. Now we're going to take some time to look at three considerations for choosing and developing a rubric. First one is, what is the rubric intended to be used for? And the key here is, when assessing for learning, we want to use a general rubric. Why? Because a general rubric is going to define successful attainment of the target. It's going to give students a vocabulary so they can begin talking about what good is. And it makes it easier to generalize from one assessment to another. So a general rubric really means less work for a teacher, because you could apply this rubric to maybe 2 or 3 different types of assignments. Second consideration is the learning target. So you want to think about what is it you're exactly assessing, and that might help determine which rubric makes most sense. When assessing specific knowledge to be learned by all students, such as how does supply and demand work, it's best to use a task-specific rubric. Here's an example from a science experiment where we have our 5 different criteria, and in the different levels of performance for each of those separate criteria. When we're assessing knowledge that students choose to demonstrate, such as a portfolio assessment where students select different pieces of work to illustrate their ability to solve problems, we would want to use a general holistic rubric. Here's an example of that. We have our 4 levels across the top, and then we have a description generally of what that looks like at those different levels. Finally, when assessing reasoning, performance, skills, or products, such as playing a musical instrument or writing a lab report, we would want to use a general analytic rubric. Example here where we have our 4 different levels, and each level is broken into the different criteria that describes performance at that level. Finally, we want to consider the learning target complexity. We would like to use holistic rubrics when the reasoning, skill, or product has one dimension. So if we're asking students to compare, a holistic rubric would work best because really comparing is the only dimension we're looking at. Analytic rubrics are best when the skill or product or the reasoning has several dimensions of quality, and importantly, these dimensions would help students to have a better understanding of what they're being asked to do. Writing is a great example where there's many traits or elements of writing that need to be considered in quality. Reflection, problem-solving strategies. Really a lot of the higher level skills we want students to perform probably are served best by an analytic rubric.